Chief Executive Officer for the California High-Speed Rail Authority. To my right is Russ Fong, who is our Chief Financial Officer for the California High-Speed Rail Authority. On March 9th, the authority released its 2018 draft business plan for public review and comment. The draft 2018 business plan presents our vision for implementing the nation's first high-speed rail system in the face of challenges that projects around the world of similar magnitude and complexity have faced and addressed. For the first time in this draft plan, the authority is assigning costs to risks previously identified in prior plans and reports and presents a baseline cost estimate for all project sections. Also, for the first time in the 2018 draft plan, we discontinued the past practice of estimating project costs with a specific dollar estimate, and instead the plan estimates costs utilizing a baseline estimate and ranges consistent with best industry practices for mega projects. The revised baseline cost estimates show an increase in costs largely driven by the effects of inflation, increased contingency, and previously identified construction delays in the Central Valley. These areas make up about 83% of the cost increases for the full Phase 1 service. For the full Phase 1 service build-out between San Francisco and Los Angeles and Anaheim. The schedule for the Valley to Valley service and the full Phase 1 service are also pushed out by 4 years in the plan, respectively, and these schedules will be affected primarily by the timing and availability of funding for full project implementation. The draft plan also continues a financing strategy consistent with the one outlined in the 2016 business plan to better align the timing of cap-and-trade funds so that the project can be delivered in a manner that provides benefits to Californians at the earliest possible time. In the face of these challenges, the draft plan proposes to continue an investment strategy that builds infrastructure in usable segments that will be linked over time to provide mobility, economic, and environmental benefits to Californians and initiate high-speed rail service as soon as possible. Toward that end, the draft business plan identifies the following investment priorities in order. The first is to meet our commitments to our federal funding partner. And that means the authority will complete the 119-mile segment in the Central Valley and complete the environmental review for the entire Phase 1 system between San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Anaheim by 2022, as is required in our federal grant agreement. Secondly, we extend the Valley to Valley service from San Francisco all the way to Bakersfield. This draft business plan recognizes the higher ridership and revenue potential by linking the Silicon Valley with the Central Valley between these two cities, San Francisco and Bakersfield. We propose to deliver 224 miles of high-speed rail-ready infrastructure for use by 2027. The plan proposes to construct high-speed rail-ready infrastructure in the Central Valley between Bakersfield and Madera, and in the Silicon Valley, Gilroy to San Francisco, to reduce travel times for existing passenger rail systems, expand clean electrified service, and prepare the corridors for testing and potential early high-speed rail operations. Fourth, we isolate the tunneling in the Pacheco Pass as the final missing link to complete the Valley to Valley service. We are engaging public and private sector expertise to examine and refine our design options for that tunneling, optimize operational efficiency, limit costs, and develop innovative funding options to complete the tunneling through the Pacheco Pass. We also, in this plan, continue the bookend investments from Proposition 1A in both Southern and Northern California. The draft business plan continues to prioritize improving Los Angeles Union Station, the Burbank to Anaheim corridor, and the electrification of the Caltrain corridor in the Bay Area. As I noted, the plan reflects the authority's commitment to apply lessons learned and make organizational improvements necessary to deliver this project to initiate high-speed rail service between Silicon and Central Valley as soon as possible, while completing environmental work and making important investments in Southern California, consistent with the action taken by the legislature to invest those bookend funds. With the release of the 2018 draft business plan, we have initiated a 60-day period of public review and comment. That period closes on May 7th, 2018. The final plan is scheduled to be adopted by the Authority Board at its public hearing during the third week of May, scheduled for San Jose at this time. I've already introduced Russ Fong, our Chief Financial Officer. He'll help me answer any questions. The other thing worth noting, Mr. Chairman and members, is that earlier this year, I think maybe either the day before or the day after I accepted this position, the legislature approved an audit of the High-Speed Rail Authority. I want to assure members that the auditors started that work. We've made office space available. They're there. They're working on the audit. I believe it will likely show where the authority has made improvements, and it'll obviously show where we must continue to make improvements in the organization, the management of the project. I do welcome this external review, and am confident that it will help us to improve program operations and management. The auditor's review is scheduled to conclude and be released sometime in August of 2018. And with that, I'm happy to answer your questions.
I'm sorry, that was August of
2018,
2018.
this year. Yeah.
Okay, in just a few months.
Yes, sir.
I believe there's been some discussion about the need for more state staff for the High-Speed Rail Authority. Is that, I don't think we've seen that request yet. When can we anticipate that?
Well, I'm not sure you'll see that this year, candidly, because we are assessing now the operations of the authority and what we need. And we do have some vacancies that we need to fill, and we're working to do that in real time. We have some agreement to borrow some staff through a cooperative agreement with Caltrans, and we are talking about that as well. So whether we come forward with a new staff request, it's a little premature for me to say right now.
Thank you. That sounds a little more efficient anyway. Questions? Mr. Patterson?
Hi.
I first of all want to let you know how that I do appreciate the candor and the effort here. This is, in my judgment, a business plan that certainly tries to get closer to what a real business plan is about, and I appreciate the fact that over the last several weeks, there in other hearings and things, there has been a real clear understanding of the difficulty that is facing us. So I'm going to explore just a couple of things. One, can you tell me what the initial operating segment it will go from where to where?
Our first full service would be Bakersfield to San Francisco under the Valley to Valley service. That'd be our first full system. However, we don't have full funding for that right now. And so we are taking an approach that's common for other transit entities around the country and state. We are going to move forward in an incremental way. And so the first is, as you know, we're in the middle of a 119-mile stretch that we have construction contracts underway for in the Central Valley. And we have an agreement with the federal government that we get operations out of those assets once they're built. So we are proposing in the business plan to incrementally get to the Valley to Valley service. And in the meantime, we would build in a way, as we have outlined in prior plans, to provide some mobility benefit with the segments that we build. So the first on the Central Valley side is a Bakersfield to Madera stretch connecting with the Amtrak service going north to Sacramento and west to the Bay Area. And on the Silicon Valley side, we are already partners in the electrification of the project from San Jose to San Francisco, and we are proposing to extend that further south to Gilroy. So we'd have an electrified section, about 224 miles in total of electrified service on two ends, and we still propose to get the isolate the tunnel as the last piece to complete Valley to Valley.
Right. So we have essentially an initial operating segment that is disconnected. I mean, it basically runs from outside Madera, I guess, to outside Bakersfield, and that will be an operation. What will run on those tracks?
Yeah, we have now engaged an early train operator that we are talking to now about how best to put that service in place. But the proposal here is to go all the way to Bakersfield in the south end, and in the north, either Madera or Merced, likely Madera, and connect there with the Amtrak system that goes further north to Sacramento and west to the Bay Area. That is an incremental use that we are examining. We want to look at whether or not we can do that with electrified high-speed trains initially, or whether we have to allow the assets to be used directly by Amtrak. And that's something that we are analyzing in real time. And I had indicated in a prior hearing we'd be reporting back to the legislature at our project update report in March.
What the language in the plan in describing high-speed, the initial operating segment has changed. The language that described it used to be high-speed rail. This business plan describes it as high-speed rail ready. What's the difference between the two?
Well, ultimately, we will have a system that is entirely a high-speed rail system connecting Bakersfield and San Francisco. As we've indicated in the plan and in prior hearings, we don't have the full funding for that at this time. So similar to what this project has never had full funding for all of its operations. And so we are proposing to build it in incremental stages. The first is meet our federal commitment in the Central Valley to get some operational use out of the assets we're building there. We want to examine, and I want to examine, whether high-speed electrified trains could be initially used there to cut down the travel times now on what is otherwise the Amtrak service. And on the west side, we want to extend the electrification of Caltrain from San Francisco to San Jose all the way to Gilroy. That will mean that Caltrain will no longer have to use diesel trains from Gilroy going north, and the whole system would be electrified. It would be ready for us, and we are examining whether we can put high-speed electrified service in there as an interim basis as early as 2026 or 2027. So that's what's in the plan. We're doing the analysis now, and we will report back to the legislature and the public on how we can put that into play in March of 2019.
That initial operating segment will run trains of some kind back and forth between Madera and Bakersfield.
Yeah, and that's a requirement we have with our federal grant agreement today.
Yeah.
That we put that,
And
we put those assets into use.
You cannot say today that they will be high-speed trains. They may very well be slow-speed trains.
Our assets initially are going, our assets for the entire Valley to Valley will be full high-speed train service once we complete all of the system, including the tunneling between the Pacheco Pass. That stretch in the Central Valley and going west will travel in excess of 200 miles per hour. When we get to the Silicon Valley, we'll travel at speeds of roughly 110 miles per hour in that corridor. So that's the system that we ultimately will build. We don't have all the funding in hand for that right now. We likely have a funding gap that is about the cost of the tunnels for that. In the interim, we do want to provide mobility benefits where we can. And if we can put electrified service in the Central Valley sooner, connecting with Amtrak, we think we reduce the Amtrak travel time by 90 minutes and may be able to reduce the state subsidy for that system. That analysis is underway now, and we'll come back with a project update report for all of you.
You do recognize the size and the difficult nature of attaining the gap funding for the tunnels.
I do, and one of the reasons that I want to isolate it on the tunnels, I think, my view is once you have some services running on either side, the tunnel becomes an obvious element in connecting the two. By focusing on the tunnel and bringing in some expertise on innovative ways to fund it and engaging our federal partners going forward, I think we can. I'm confident we'll find a way to get there on a specific asset that will have obvious mobility benefits.
With the electrification from Gilroy to San Jose, that's along Union Pacific lines.
Correct.
Do you have permission for that purpose?
As we indicated in the plan, we are currently in talks with UP.
How would you describe those talks?
Positive.
So you think that Union Pacific will eventually agree to
Well,
allow you access?
Look, I don't know if they're in the room. It's a negotiation, and we are talking about that. And what we would do is use that right away to electrify 2 tracks that are for passenger rail and maintain a freight track for their use in the right of way. It is the least impactful way to get into that section that ultimately we will need, and we continue to work with them in good faith on trying to get that done.
Your business plan anticipates a rather, I think, dubious approach to the financing, which is the cap and trade. It requires extensions and the like. And our legislative analyst office has said that a complete and viable funding plan does not exist. Funding it in the business plan seems to rely on extending cap and trade. From your business plan, you're suggesting to prohibit the legislature from restricting, redistributing, or impairing the authority's cap and trade for 30 years, extension of the cap-and-trade program through 2050, and guarantee that the legislature will backfill any shortfall if cap-and-trade auctions bring in less revenue. Are you aware that that kind of a plan is going to require a vote of the people?
I think that's an open question right now. I want to say this about the cap-and-trade program. In the 2016 business plan, there was an assumption of cap-and-trade revenue all the way to 2050, and we indicated that for building a mega project of this size, you want to be able to finance any revenue stream so that you can match revenues with your capital costs as you're building. If we don't have some kind of a financing capacity against the revenue streams dedicated to the project, it will be difficult to stay on schedule. And so just as we said in 2016, we want to try to be able to bring forward some of the dollars that are otherwise continuously appropriated to this project through the cap-and-trade mechanism. And so industry had given us, here are 3 things you look for the highest investment grade investment grade status of a financing. You want to have non-impairment, you want to have a commitment to 2050, and you want to have a floor of funding. I candidly don't know if we can get all those things, but it's not a go or no go. We need authority to finance against it. We need it to be as strongest as it could be, that commitment, to make sure we can do the financing. However strong it is in statute and articulated in the law, we will get, it will reflect our risk or cost of capital. So with these 3 elements, we'd have the very cheapest cost of capital. With elements that are, shades of gray on it, the cost of capital might go higher. But we would still, there's large sort of swings in what you need to do basic financing. Well, our point is we need to finance the revenue stream to bring the dollars forward to meet the capital costs at the time we have them to build the project. And that was something we said in 2016, and it's something we're repeating in 2018.
Well, again, I really do want to focus. You have made some specific contingencies in the plan to access cap and trade. And our legislative council has advised us that only a vote of the people can require a future legislature to commit funds or prohibit a future legislature from changing an appropriation. Mm-hmm. Are you aware and do you concur that what is in your business plan requires a vote of the people?
I don't necessarily concur with that yet, because I don't know that to be true against the cap and trade revenue stream. I think we now have a continuous appropriation. If we are given legislative authority to revenue bond off that appropriation, but we can't do the impairment, we'd still go forward with trying to finance this. Maybe without the impairment, and maybe it means that we don't have as high a rated financing structure as possible. But a continuous appropriation is pretty good, which we already have. An authority to issue revenue bonds off of that stream is helpful. It would be useful to have some floor of a commitment in there. Under the law today, as a continuously appropriated matter, we have 25%. If there's a floor that's tied to that, it would help us finance against that revenue stream.
Well, for this member, it seems pretty cut and dried that what you're proposing in the business plan is going to require a vote of the people. If it becomes evident that in order to actualize the business plan, would you be going to a vote of the people? Is that an option as you consider at least the business plan in front of us, which I think does actually require at least a change in the state constitution? So I think there's got to be some kind of vote of the people here to let you do what you are planning to do.
What we put in the business plan, and as we couched the 3 things you need for the highest investment grade financing, we outlined what the industry gave us as these are the 3 things you need. I look at it having come from the legislature and look at it and say, okay, those are 3 things that the industry point out as the best things you need for an investment grade rating. I don't know that you can get all those things, but I do think you can still finance with less. And what we said in the plan is we'd work with the Department of Finance and the legislature on exactly what the financing authority looks like to go forward. So I don't have a plan right now to go to the vote of the people. I'm not sure we need to go to the vote of the people. We'll look at that, and we will work with the legislature on how we can best define how we can finance against the revenue stream already committed to the project. And our hope is to get some kind of financing so that we can make sure we can deliver the project and the elements of the project sooner rather than later. That's the number one need or push for the financing, is just to make sure we can meet capital costs sooner.
And again, Legislative Council has opined on this, and I think that's a significant opinion, and I think it needs to be paid attention to.
And before you respond, we've now kind of gone through this discussion several times, so I think we get it.
Finally, I'm generally concerned about what is Plan B. On the surface of it, this does not look like it's going to get completed. I know you are optimistic and you want to be innovative and all of that, but economic gravity is really kicking in here, and I want to know if there is a Plan B. What happens if you just simply cannot build the entire system? Are you considering a Plan B? Is there a contingency plan of some kind?
Well, Mr. Patterson, I guess I'd say that's going to be a conversation that's broader than just us. It's going to involve the legislature and us going forward. I've stepped into this, and I know what I have, and I know that it's short of what we need, and the project has always been in that condition since the day the voters approved the original bonds. They've never had all the money they need to go. And so the authority adopted a principle that said, with the funding we have, we will build incrementally to provide benefits early, hopefully linking all of the investments we make for the full system. And that, I think, is the appropriate way to go when you don't have every dollar you need for the full system. So I'm proposing a business plan based on what I know we have, and I know we have to do work with our federal partners, we have to continue to do work with the private sector, and we have to continue to do work with all of you to ensure that we can keep building the system. I took this job and I do this because I think it's an important project for the future of the state. I'm not espousing a Plan B right now because I want to move forward on what we have, and I want to, show that we can deliver and perform. And as we do that, I think incrementally we can build the system.
My understanding is that the authority has completed a contingency plan document for early service operations of the first construction section, that was required by the Federal Railroad Administration as part of the cooperative agreement with them for grant funding, page 51 of the FRA document. Are you aware of a contingent plan document that was submitted to FRA in 2016? And if so, we think that there's ample evidence that there is a contingency plan there. I think this committee ought to be able to see it, and I would like to see it as well.
If it's what I think you're referencing, I believe it's available on our website. And if it's not available on our website, I'm happy to make it available to you. There is a requirement that, as I said at the outset, that with the respect to the federal money we're using in the Central Valley, we have to apply and provide them with a plan of operation for the assets we build. And we did provide that in October of 2016. I think it's available on our website. If it's not, we'll make it available to the committee right away.
Appreciate that.
And it's consistent, I will say it's consistent with what we've outlined in the business plan of how we would go forward.
Our analysts have repeatedly requested that document.
You'll have it today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fong?
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for being here again, and thank you for your testimony at the Transportation Committee. I won't rehash a lot of the concerns that we had there, or I just want to kind of go in kind of a different direction, which is the authority's agreement with the federal government requires that all the work in the Central Valley portion must be completed by December 31st of 2022. Mm-hmm. What happens if the authority fails to meet that deadline?
Well, a couple things. One, we'd probably have to engage in some kind of negotiation with the FRA for an extension, if possible. We're not there yet, but I would say you could be open to repayment provisions of federal funds. But again, I think typically what's happened before is that was once an earlier deadline that was renegotiated some time ago, well before I got here, out to 2022. So we work with the FRA all the time on a weekly and daily basis, and we would probably be in discussions with them well in advance of that deadline about should it move. But certainly our intention and my objective today is to meet those deadlines as we articulated in the business plan.
So there is a concern that there would be repayment if we didn't meet that deadline. I mean, there's that possibility.
It's theoretically possible, although I think in practice, as we've already seen, we've worked with the FRA to renegotiate dates.
I think the biggest concern, as I hear you answer questions to Mr. Patterson and to the public at large, is that we hear phrases like unfunded assets, missing link, funding gaps. At what point is this project cost prohibitive? Is there that assessment that you would make?
You know, for the entirety of the system and the mobility benefits that it would bring, there was some work done back in 2012 that said, what else would you have to do to provide the same level of mobility benefits through highway expansions, airport expansions, and other things. And it's roughly double the cost of our baseline cost estimate. So I don't know exactly where that line is, but that data is out there, it's available, and it's public. My objective and what we've outlined in the business plan is to proceed in a way where we do not have stranded assets, where the assets we build will be put into use. We do have an unfunded portion in the Valley to Valley, and we're going to focus effort and time on that. But the stranded asset issue is one that I would push back on lightly, just because our objective is to invest in a way where we do not have stranded assets going forward, but things are being put into use.
So just to reiterate, there is no point, there is no threshold that if the costs continue to grow or expand, that you would tunnel forward no matter what, no pun intended, that there would be no point that where the project would be, what, we think we need to reassess, and that this project may not be the way that we should go?
I don't know what that is right now, today. I think, again, I'm building something with available revenues I have in an incremental way. We have a cost estimate that we're, for the Valley to Valley section, that I think will be a very useful segment, and we have an estimate that we're, we can close the gap on. I'm pretty confident of going forward. So, so I don't have a better answer than that today on that. I'm focused on trying to get it done.
And then my last question, certainly this budget or this draft business plan has evolved since the beginning of the project. Do you not see a point where the public should have another say on this project?
Again, I'm here to try to implement the voters' will. And to me, we went to the voters and asked for 1/5 of the then estimated costs, and they approved it. And I'm seeing numbers that suggest there's still generally that same level of support. And my job is try to implement what we have. And I'm focused on that, and that's what I'm doing. And I haven't really thought beyond using the resources I have to try to deliver the project as best I can. And that's really what my focus is.
But would you agree, though, that what the voters voted on in Prop 1A, when what the project is today, has changed?
No,
Different?
no. I would say that our objective is to build the 1A system, and we have to build it incrementally. And we have to build it incrementally because we don't have all the money we need to build it all at once. And so, but what we will build will be the 1A project.
But the business plan has changed. The business plan has evolved.
Yeah, the business plan every 2 years is a snapshot of where this is. I think this business plan has some continuity with the 2016 business plan in terms of what the priorities are and what the principles are that we bring. There are important differences between how we present those things in the past and how I present them to you all today. And it's very clear that we have uncertainties and risk that we have to deal with. And that makes it hard to build a mega project. But we were, it's a candid description of what those uncertainties and risks are and our approach in the face of those things. And that's what I feel like I'm obligated to present to you all and lay out a strategy for how we'll go forward, and that's what I've done.
Well, I appreciate your testimony. I think that as we review the business plan, I think that there are certainly, the fact that there's uncertainties is an understatement. And I think that there is going to be a point where we're going to have to decide realistically and objectively, and looking at this with all the facts in front of us, that whether this project should move forward at all. And I hope that the authority would do the same thing and say, is this feasible? Because if the gaps exist and we can't connect the two, if Pacheco Pass isn't built, we have two stranded lines that may function on its own, but they never connect. And so if the assessment is we're gonna do this no matter what, but we don't know where the money's coming from, I think we have to have a real assessment of whether that's whether we should continue down that path. So I thank you very much.
We will certainly engage in that conversation going forward. Absolutely. For me personally, I believe the benefits of the project are so immense that in my time doing transportation policy, I haven't seen a single project that offers as much mobility and environmental and economic benefit. So I'm committed to try to get it done.
And just out of curiosity, what was the original cost of the project under Prop 1A?
I think it was $45 billion referenced in the voter pamphlet, is my recollection.
Okay, and then now it's 77 and 98 billion.
Yeah, and at one time it was 33 and 64, and that's why, I've taken an approach in this business plan to not, come forward when we're so early in the project development to try to specify a single dollar, but to say, here's our best estimate, here's the ranges we're going to work in, and that my management obligation is to try to come in below that baseline.
Well, thank you. I mean, from my perspective, right, this is not our money. This is taxpayer money.
I agree.
And so we got to make sure that we protect that as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I want to ask a follow-up to Mr. Funk's question. Mr. Kelly, you're the CEO of the High Speed Rail Authority, and if I'm not mistaken, the High Speed Rail Authority is an authority that is required under the terms of the ballot measure. Is that right?
I'm sorry,
The
required.
High Speed Rail Authority was created under the terms of the ballot measure, or pursuant
No.
to it?
The authority itself was created in statute prior to the ballot measure. Prior to the ballot measure.
Prior to the ballot
Yes.
measure.
Yes. At one point in time, forgive me, I may not have all this history exactly, but it was a commission at one point in time with a study. Then it became an authority with appointed members. Then there was a ballot measure that passed, and since that time they've had some expanded enabling statutes.
And what I'm getting at here is, or where I want to go with this, is what exactly are the parameters of responsibility that are allocated to the High Speed Rail Authority? Because when I hear my colleagues asking you to weigh in on whether something should go to the voters or not, that to me is something that Governor may want to ask us to do, but is within the responsibilities of the legislature. So I'm just, if you can clarify for us what your responsibilities are.
I mean, generally, the authority's responsibilities are to develop and implement the system, the high-speed rail system, and at a very high level, that's what they're charged with doing. I'm appointed by the board and responsible to the board to manage the organization toward that objective.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's helpful for us to step back sometimes and remember what the structure is, and it is very complicated. It's a complicated structure that is responsible for a very complicated project, as we learn on an annual basis. Mr. Mullen, you have questions?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Kelly, for the presentation, for your candor, for your prior service as our Transportation Secretary. I could think of no better person to take over this Herculean task than you, piecing this all together, state and federal, and we need a better federal partner going forward. There's no question about it, to make this all a reality. In particular, I want to call out and Thank you for the partnership with Caltrain. You mentioned the extension to Gilroy, which will be crucial for phasing out the diesel in that what is being called the Northern California Bookend Project. I know it is the Caltrain Electrification Project, and ultimately a shared system, which is truly fundamentally important for the Silicon Valley region. We have a very low unemployment rate, lots of revenue generation, wealth generation, but employers are having lots of difficulty with retaining employees given the cost of living in that area. But this entire electrified project is going to be transformative economically, environmentally, and you have been an excellent partner with Jim Hartnett. I see Seamus Murphy from Caltrain here. I've seen government at work in a collaborative way in that entire corridor, looking at it holistically, not only the Caltrain line, but the Highway 101, given the major employers we have in that area and the economic and budget importance to the state of California. So I'm grateful for the work in that regard, and look forward to continual updates, and hopefully as this project rolls out and as it becomes a reality, we can get some more federal assistance to make this all work. But I thank you for taking on this massive challenge in front of you, and I have full confidence in your abilities and the oversight capability here of SUB3, as we'll be getting continual updates as the project moves forward. But thank you for the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen.
Mr. Patterson?
With respect to cost and time,
Yeah.
and if I am not understanding it precisely, it appears to me that back when the authority got the federal money, there were conditions on it to use it so you get it out fast. My understanding is that as a result of that, we were actually shoving a lot of money into construction when we did not have property. And that has been a significant problem with respect to cost and delay. It seems to me that somewhere in some of your early comments, maybe in the media, that you recognized that, and I think you characterized it as we didn't really price in and analyze the cost and delay risks of thoroughly in that kind of approach. Now that you're at the helm, will that be a significantly changed approach? In other words, you'll put the money out when you got the property and not before.
I appreciate the question. Chapter 4 of our business plan goes into great detail on that issue, and you're right that the federal dollars that were made available had an expenditure deadline on them to spend by September 2017. So the authority was quick into going to construction contracts, and it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the investments in the valley have paid off with some pretty impressive economic output numbers by getting that construction going. You can see structures and employment in the area, and that's all extraordinarily positive. On the flip side, you're right, they didn't have all the right-of-way in hand prior to releasing those construction contracts, which means you don't have all the risk identified and mitigated. As a matter of practice going forward, what I've said and what we noted in the business plan is that moving forward, we would not repeat that approach. We would sort of have all the things in the box known, identified, and mitigated to the best of our ability before we go into construction contracts.
Yeah, contracting and committing before property has also led, at least I'm aware of one lawsuit. There may be more with respect to the small business owners that had the contract, and in a couple, and they contact me in the
Sure.
district office with concern over they're not getting paid on time. They really need to be getting paid on time. But beyond that, where at least one, maybe two lawsuits, maybe more, are with small businesses that maybe got $1 million contract for utility movement, and then maybe they had 5 or 6 parcels. They were able to complete a couple of them. They did not have access to the balance of them. And as a result, they have utilized all of their surety bond capacity, right, to put it up, which means they don't have any capacity to go and bid other projects outside of high-speed rail. It seems to me that connects back to decisions to contract and push money out before you had the property, which now had the domino effect of hitting some of these small businesses. So I appreciate that you're aware of it, you understand it, and hopefully that it does not happen again.
I agree.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you,
Well,
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kelly, I hope that it doesn't happen again, but I also hope that we don't have another Great Recession. And one of the reasons that the federal government was pushing to have that money spent by 2017 is to get that funding on the ground, people hired and working in one of the areas of greatest unemployment, which continues to be the case, unfortunately. But it was one of the areas of highest unemployment in the state. And my understanding is that for the first time since the Great Recession, unemployment in Fresno County is now down below 10%, and that growth there in Fresno County is outpacing the rest of the state. There's 3,100 full-time jobs that are existing now as a result of this project and that funding. So I get the downside, but and I'm not faulting you for this, but you kind of glossed over the flip side of it, the positive benefit that that this has brought to the state. You did mention jobs, but you did it very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And I think when we evaluate a project of this magnitude, we have to look at everything. That's our responsibility here in this committee, and the economic benefit of a project like this simply cannot be understated, particularly in a county that has suffered the worst unemployment in the state of California. Fresno County has seen $2 billion in economic activity since the project broke ground in 2015. That's a lot of money to be spending in one county, and I'm glad that we are.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think I said it was sort of a double-edged sword. The upside has certainly been the economic impact from the investment. I mean, not only are we moving forward with the assets that are important, but as you said, 1,800 craft laborers are out working on the job today. That number will grow as we get expanded construction sites. 437 small businesses in California have been working on the project from up and down the state. And I think by one estimate, about a third of the job creation in 2016-17 in Fresno County was tied to this project. So very proud of that, and think that there's no doubt it has had this great economic impact just by the infusion of the dollars in this investment. And as I said, there are 3 elements of this project that I am so attracted to it for, and that is environmental, mobility, and economic. And the economic numbers are loud in the Central Valley and will expand as we move the project forward.
Now, you also responded to an earlier question about the cost of the project and whether the project still has value even if the cost goes up to a different amount. And you mentioned that you need to take into consideration what we're measuring against. And you mentioned highway expansion and airport expansion as 2 of those. You're the former transportation secretary, so you're probably the ideal person to be asking this question, and that is, how much capacity do we have in the state of California to actually spend money to expand highways and to expand airports? And while you're answering that question, you might want to touch on whether or not airport expansion and highway expansion, if we could do it, comports with our climate change goals.
The short answer is it's very constrained in many areas of the state, particularly urban areas, in terms of the ability to expand highways further. In some places, the highway structure is largely built out in our urban areas. In other areas, there's some opportunity. And of course, I think every major airport in California is looking to expand in some way, and they're having great difficulty in doing so. As a sort of climate change matter, obviously, to me, the benefit that I see so attractive about the opportunity to provide Californians with an additional way to move between 2 points in a fraction of the time it takes them to drive today is to me one of the key beneficial elements of this project. I'm trying to provide Californians with an opportunity to get between A and B in a fraction of the time they can otherwise do it. And so that is the key element, and obviously simply adding more lanes and more cars would continue what has been a long history in California of serious congestion and air quality issues. That if you overlay where this project would be, it's in the heart of some of those most areas most impacted by both those issues. So, in short, it's a travel alternative made available to Californians that have a lot of upside in terms of mobility and environmental, and that's why I'm so interested in it.
Thank you. My colleague from San Mateo mentioned the housing issue and the need to move people from jobs-rich areas to housing-rich areas, and to create new opportunities for housing and jobs in various parts of the state. And I certainly think that's something that we need to focus on. But we, I think, oftentimes lose sight of the fundamental reasons that the high-speed rail the reasons for building the high-speed rail project, and it's worthwhile for us to touch on those periodically. For those who follow my Twitter account, folks have seen me get upset as I sit on the tarmac at LAX because there aren't gates open, and we have to think about where we are in time and where we want the state of California to be in a few years. Do we want to remain static and not be able to improve our infrastructure so that we can accommodate a growing population, so that we can accommodate the transportation needs of coming decades? And if we're not thinking big picture about that, then I think we're really making a big mistake. So thank you very much for your presentation. If there's no additional questions, we actually have two other panels on this topic, or the subtopics therein, and we'll move on to panel number 2. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The rest of your staff shouldn't be so quiet next time. They might prefer it that way. Panel 2 is an evaluation of the 2018 draft business plan. We have Lou Thompson, the chair of the California High-Speed Rail Peer Review Group, and Tom Van Heek, fiscal and policy analyst with the LAO. And we'll start with Mr. Thompson. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's an opportunity that I'm grateful for to appear before you today. My name is Lou Thompson. I'm the chairman of the peer review group that reports to the legislature on issues related to High-Speed Rail Authority's business plans. As you may know, the peer review group was created in Proposition 1A. There are supposed to be 8 of us. There have been between 3 and 7 at one time or the other. And our job officially is to comment on the business plans. But we also have commented on other things that the authority is doing that we thought would be of interest to the legislature. We have thus far written 15 letters to the legislature on one or the other topics, many of the business plans, but other topics that we have thought were important. We sent a letter to the legislature commenting on the draft 2018 business plan on March the 30th. I want to summarize our comments here today. They fall into 2 categories. One is the policy changes, and the other are some substantive comments that we have on the business plan itself. The policy issues, I believe, are much more important than the detailed comments, so I want to address them first. The group believes that the high-speed rail project has now reached a point where difficult decisions need to be made about the project's future scope and funding. Quite simply, as a result of cost increases and changes in funding sources, the authority can no longer complete a link from the Central Valley to either the LA Basin or San Jose and the Peninsula. Thus, as it stands today, there is little prospect of a system that would generate enough cash flow to contribute to future investment. This dilemma does not come as a surprise. It happens nearly every time when we try to translate a mega project from a grand vision into a working system, and it is not necessarily a reflection on the competence or honesty of the people who are trying to run the project. The critical question, though, is where do we go from here? The draft plan doesn't really discuss options in addressing this question. Mr. Patterson, you raised this question. The group laid out 4 very general options in our letter, but we don't pretend that these are the only ones or that people couldn't come up with better ones. The first option is we could just stop and go home, pay off whatever we have to pay off and stop. The second is we could complete the work in the Central Valley along with whatever contract obligations we have on the bookends. The third, we could adopt what is in effect the proposal in the draft plan and add a connection to Gilroy and Bakersfield and improve the LA Union Station while awaiting better command over the design and cost of the Pacheco Pass tunnels. Or fourth, we could recommit to the full Phase 1 with the understanding that such a decision would have to be based on adoption of a credible long-term plan to finance the system, including the possibility that system costs might well come in at the upper end of the range. We don't view the first option, simply stopping, as credible. It would leave California with nothing useful, and the state might have to pay back the federal money. The second option, stopping with the Central Valley plus the existing bookend improvements, would work, but it would limit the value of the result. The third option, as in the draft plan, probably makes the best of the existing situation, especially in bringing near-term benefits to the millions of current passengers on the bookends. But it leaves the state short of a system that would be able to contribute to financing of the remainder of the system. The fourth option, completing Phase 1 as originally planned, meets the requirements of Proposition 1A, but cannot be done with the current funding provisions and sources. Simply put, we do not believe that it is fair or credible any longer to ask management to deliver a long-term project of this size and complexity with sources of funding that are inadequate in total and unreliable in any given year. If the project is to go ahead beyond essentially the second option, the state will need to develop a source of funding that is up to the task. This is not a new issue. It has always been a funding gap, as Mr. Kelly said, and it was very clear in the 2016 business plan that there was a gap that would have to be funded in order to build a system to the point where it could begin to generate potential investment from the private sector. What is new is the increasing size of the gap, along with a clearer understanding of the need to make high-speed rail authorities' funding stable and predictable. There are obvious ways to fill the gap: increase the share of cap-and-trade receipts going to the authority and guarantee the authority's income. A tax on fuels or sales tax was proposed in the 2000 business plan. There are other sources that might emerge, like future federal grant programs, federal loans, et cetera, but then again, they might not. The problem will need to be addressed in one way or another if even the third option is to be completed. In parallel with dealing with the need for an improved approach to funding, especially the state's role, because the state's role is likely to grow, we recommend that the legislature revalidate the priority of the high-speed rail in the light of the competing needs elsewhere in transportation and elsewhere in the overall budget. This is a task that the governor's office and the Department of Transportation, along with the communities affected, would be well suited to carry out for the legislature. We do have some recommendations, as I said at the outset, for specific changes in the final plan. They should include inputs from the early operator. We have recommended for many years that the early operator would be able to advise them on how to build a system and how they should plan to operate it. Those inputs are not yet available, but they should be made available as soon as possible. They should provide a better explanation of the business model. It may look like this is a construction project right now, and it is, but that's not what it is long range. They're actually building a business to serve the people of California, and yet the way in which they want to provide that business and structure themselves is not at all clear, and that needs to be clarified. They need to put more emphasis on developing detailed agreements with the bookend operators and the freight railroads. Thus far, those agreements have not reached the level at which they really know how is it going to operate, how much is it going to cost, and how will they work together. They need to develop a long-range program for addressing grade crossings, especially because the section Gilroy to San Jose now will be more of a conventional operation. There'll be even more grade crossings than there are now, and high-speed trains don't mix with grade crossings. They need to clarify the performance of the system as they're shown in their trip time calculations and schedules, because the structure of the system has changed, and therefore how will it operate in the future. They need to continue the emphasis on showing their projection as ranges rather than point estimates. Actually, there is no point estimate. There's a high level, there's a low level, and all kinds of outcomes in between there. They need to do a better job of presenting that. And they need to provide better backup for their claims for benefits and public benefits to urban and regional development. While we hope these can be addressed in the final plan, we believe the legislature's immediate focus should be on the funding and policy issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. You always find you present us with a very organized way of framing the issues. I really appreciate that. We're going to pause for a moment since we have a full complement of committee members, subcommittee members here, and handle our business on the vote-only calendar. But first, we will take roll.
Bloom.
Here?
Fong. Calra. Mullen. Patterson.
My understanding is there's agreement on issues 1, 3 through 7, 10 through 18, and 20 through 24 on the vote-only calendar. Is there a motion? Thank you. Second. A motion and a second. Let's vote.
Bloom.
Aye.
Fong. Calra. Mullen. Patterson.
Do I hear a motion on item number 2, issue 2, on the vote-only calendar?
Bloom.
Aye.
Fong. No. Calra. Mullen. Patterson. No.
Issue 8. We have a motion?
Bloom.
Aye.
Fong. No. Calra. Mullen. Patterson. No.
Issue 9.
Bloom.
Aye.
Fong. Calra. Mullen. Patterson.
And finally, issue 19.
Bloom.
Aye.
Fong. Calra. Mullen. Patterson.
Thank you. That completes the vote-only calendar. And let me welcome Assemblymember Calra to our Assembly Subcommittee. He's here on temporary assignment, but I think you'll find this interesting and worthwhile time spent. All right, who have we got next? Mr. Van Heek.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I believe a handout has been passed out.
Yes.
Great. My remarks will parallel the handout, so feel free to follow along. Tom Van Heek with the LAO. Ross Brown, our office's cap and trade expert, is also here with us this morning on the panel to answer questions in that regard specifically. As you know, state law requires the California High-Speed Rail Authority to prepare a business plan every even year that provides certain key information about the planned high-speed rail project. Our office typically reviews that plan and offers comments and analysis in a setting such as this one. This presentation this morning is going to provide some background information on the planned high-speed rail system, describe major changes proposed in the draft 2018 business plan, and identify issues for legislative consideration. I'll be picking up the handout on page 2. which just sets the background. Of course, Proposition 1A, we've discussed that this morning. In addition to authorizing $10 billion in bond authority to support construction of the project, that also set a variety of system criteria for the system to meet, including train speeds and travel times between certain key destinations. Overall, the project vision has been divided into 2 phases. Phase 1 of the system would provide service for about 500 miles from San Francisco to Anaheim. Phase 2 would connect that system north to Sacramento and south to San Diego. In 2016, the authority estimated phase 1 of the system would be completed in 2029 at a cost of $64 billion, and at this time has not provided estimates of the cost or schedule for phase 2. On page 3, I'll discuss the project delivery plan for phase 1. Phase 1 has been divided into segments. The initial operating segment is one that we've discussed this morning that would carry passengers from the Silicon Valley to the Central Valley, and is commonly referred to as the valley-to-valley line. In 2016, the authority estimated that the IOS would cost about $21 billion and initially operate between San Jose and a terminus north of Bakersfield starting in 2025. Construction of the IOS began in the Central Valley with the ICS, that's the initial construction segment. That's the 119-mile segment running through the Central Valley from Madera, somewhat north of Fresno, to Shafter, somewhat north of Bakersfield. In 2016, the authority estimated completing construction of the ICS at a cost of $7.3 billion. On page 4, I'll discuss the 3 primary sources of capital funding that have gone to the project thus far. Those include, of course, Proposition 1A bonds. The proposition authorized the state to sell $10 billion in general obligation bonds to support the development of the high-speed rail system. At this time, the state has sold about $2.3 billion of that authority and has spent or committed about $1.7 billion of those bonds sold. Second are federal funds. The authority has received a total of $3.5 billion in federal funds, comprised of a grant through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, as well as what's commonly referred to as the FY10 grant, a $929 million grant, which has not yet been expended, unlike those ARA funds, which were fully expended by their deadline in September 2017. Finally, cap and trade auction revenues. The legislature adopted legislation to continuously appropriate, beginning in 2015-16, 25% of annual cap and trade auction revenue for the planning and capital costs of phase 1 of the high-speed rail project. At this time, a total of roughly $1.5 billion in cap and trade revenues have been provided to the authority. As of December 2017, the authority reported spending about $583 million of those funds. On page 6, I'll begin describing some of the major features of the draft 2018 plan, although certainly some of those have been described already this morning, so I won't dwell on them too long. But first, it's worth noting again that the project scope and timeline have changed in the draft 2018 plan versus the last iteration of the business plan in 2016. The IOS now will extend from San Francisco to Bakersfield rather than from San Jose to Shafter, thus connecting 2 larger population centers. The plan also assumes a delay in operation of the IOS, now proposed to operate 4 years later in 2029 rather than 2025 as previously assumed. The bottom of page 5 has a map illustrating the various components of the phase 1 project, which could be helpful. As we've heard, interim services are proposed on completed construction segments. Previously, under the 2016 plan, no rail services were expected to begin until full completion of the IOS. However, the draft 2018 plan proposes operating early interim services on the initial construction segment, as we've heard, as well as on the San Francisco to Gilroy corridor. The plan suggests that the completed segments could host enhanced Caltrain or Amtrak services or potentially abbreviated high-speed rail operations. Project construction costs have been revised upward, as we've heard this morning. The central cost estimate today is $77.3 billion, which is about $13 billion higher than it was in 2016. Capital cost estimates are presented for phase 1 in a table at the bottom of page 6, and those compare costs between the 16 and 18 plans for your reference. The authority states that greater contingency estimates, cost escalation due to schedule delays, and increased costs for construction of the initial construction segment account for most of the overall cost increase for the project. Today, the draft plan reflects an increase in construction costs for the IOS from $20.7 billion to $29.5 billion. The project funding plan to date identifies full funding for the initial construction segment. Remember, that's that 119 miles through the Central Valley. These sources include Proposition 1A bond funds, federal grants, and cap and trade revenues. The plan assumes the further extension of the cap and trade program and then the securitization of those revenues to complete the IOS, the initial operating segment between San Francisco and Bakersfield. That means extending the program through to 2050, while that program is currently only authorized through 2030. Finally, the plan assumes additional funding becomes available for the remainder of Phase 1. At this time, the balance of Phase 1, which would be constructing south from Bakersfield into Los Angeles and Anaheim, is expected to cost $47.8 billion. And the draft plan assumes that funding becomes available to support those costs. While the plan does not identify specific funding sources and amounts, it does discuss some potential options, including a combination of federal sources or borrowing against the net operating revenues of the initial operating segment. The plan raises several issues for legislative consideration. The first being that the actual project costs could be even higher than the central cost estimate indicates. As we've heard this morning, the authority now introduces costs in a range, and that is an improvement in this plan and is more transparent on the full potential costs of construction. It does mean, however, that Phase 1 could cost as much as $98 billion, as opposed to the $77 billion in the central cost estimate. Second, there are significant uncertainties regarding funding to complete the IOS. A large portion of the funding identified for that project would come from borrowing against future cap and trade auction revenues through 2050. Thus, without legislative action to extend the cap and trade program, it's unlikely that those funds would be available. To the extent that the level of auction revenues assumed in the draft plan do not materialize or the project's costs are much higher than estimated, the state would also need to identify other fund sources to help finance the IOS, including potentially the general fund. Third, there's no complete funding plan for the remainder of Phase 1. While the plan discusses the possibility of securitizing the net operating revenues of the initial operating segment, there are potential challenges to this approach. First, it's unclear that the initial system will generate an operating surplus. Second, the authority anticipates that securitizing the net cash flow would make additional funding available no sooner than 2032, even though funds would likely be needed earlier to complete Phase 1 by 2033 as assumed. Third, the plan estimates that the amount of funding that can be generated would fall substantially short of the level needed to complete Phase 1 and does not specifically identify how that shortfall would be met. In view of those concerns, our fourth issue for consideration this morning is that a full funding plan is crucial for the high-speed rail project's success. And at this time, a complete and viable funding plan does not exist. Happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you for your report. Do we have any questions? Mr. Patterson, we'll start with you.
Thank you.
Followed by Mr. Fong.
I want to visit the specific proposal in the business plan with respect to, and I'm reading from the plan, prohibit the legislature from restricting, redistributing, or impairing the authority's cap and trade appropriation for 30 years, extension of the cap and trade program through 2050, and guarantee that the legislature will backfill any shortage if cap and trade auctions bring in less revenue than projected. Earlier, I questioned with respect to the viability of doing this without a vote of the people because of the Legislative Council's advice, particularly that the vote of the people is going to be required, future legislature to commit funds or prohibit a future legislature from changing an appropriation. It seems to me that the finance plan we're looking at right now is I think, very much iffy, because I think it's going to require a vote, because the Constitution, I think, is pretty clear that you just can't do this kind of commitment legislature to legislature over a long period of time. Do you concur that that financing plan does have an element to it that's going to require a voter engagement?
It comes down to the specifics of the proposed financial package, and we haven't conferred with council at this time, so I'm not in a position to give a definitive answer to that question, but it would certainly depend on the details of the proposed financing. It's not inconceivable that it would, but as I mentioned, without conferring with council, I can't say any more.
With respect to using cap and trade revenue over an extended period of time, I thought the presumption with respect to cap and trade was that it was going to decline over time as the requirement to purchase and trade these allowances will in fact change behavior, and that CO2 would in fact decline over time, and that ultimately cap and trade should fulfill its expectations and essentially at some place go away. It seems to me that if you're asking private investment people, the underwriters, to take a significant risk with that kind of financing, when there is a 30-year bond requirement with a flattening or declining stream of revenue to pay principal and interest, that just seems to me to be a stream of revenue that cannot be counted on over time. Would you concur with that? Is that a risk factor in this kind of financing?
Ross Brown with the LAO. Assemblymember Patterson, certainly there is quite a bit of uncertainty around future cap and trade revenues. We've done some looks out to 2030, but certainly if you're even looking beyond that, there's even greater uncertainty about what that revenue stream would look like. I think in our view, at least in the medium term, it's not entirely clear on the long term, but in the medium term, there are a couple different factors that could affect the revenue. Some of them have sort of a downward push on the amount of revenue. As you mentioned, the number of allowances perhaps that are sold is decreasing. That's offset, and to some extent maybe even more than offset, by potential increases in the prices of those allowances. So at least through 2030, you can sort of see where those might balance each other out, and so it's not necessarily a declining revenue stream. But your point about sort of over the long term out to 2050, and if our emissions are very, very low during that period, we don't really know exactly what prices will be at that point, and so there certainly is a lot of uncertainty out that far.
Again, the Legislative Council has opined on this, and we'll provide that opinion, which really, I think this plan conflicts with constitutional constraints on the legislature doing this. But also, wouldn't it be true that any extension of cap and trade will have to reach the 2/3 vote threshold, not merely a majority vote?
I'm not sure we could sort of say with 100% certainty. I think at the very least, if an extension were approved with a majority vote, there would be a lot of legal uncertainty around the ability to do that in the program, and so and that creates potential problems for trying to finance based on that. I think that's a legal question there where there's not 100% uncertainty, but certainly a 2/3 vote would provide a lot more certainty about the future of the program.
And again, I'm basically looking at this through the viability of a finance plan that has these kinds of uncertainties, and those kinds of uncertainties investors are going to know about, and the rating agencies are going to know about. You just can't hide this kind of uncertainty. And so I do think it's a rather dubious approach to the big picture finance. And I think it has been suggested here that sooner or later this legislature is going to decide whether it's going to fully fund this or whether it is not. And that, I believe, is going to require a vote of the people. We committed to certain things and certain timelines, certain speeds, certain costs. But if we are going to really put money where our mouth is, it's going to require serious action by and the people of the state of California are going to have to weigh in on that. They voted on this initially, and I think if you're going to make huge and deep changes in how it's financed and the risk factors involved in it, it's going to require the same kind of transparency, openness, full discussion, debate, and I think a vote of the people. In other words, I think leadership ought to really recognize that this is in a serious, serious place, and that asking the voters, again, we're not building what we said we were going to build. It isn't going to produce the speeds, the time. The costs are very excessive, and here's how we're going to have to fund it. I think we owe it to the people to ask them again, under these circumstances with these costs, shouldn't we ask their permission at the ballot box if we're going to change a huge, significant commitment of general fund money or general obligation bond money for these purposes. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Patterson. May I ask for clarification from you, Mr. Patterson? Did you indicate that there's a written opinion from the legislative analyst?
Apparently not. The opinion has been given to us informally, and we're asking that it be formalized. But I would suggest this. ask our legal counsel about it. They'll give you the same answer that they've given to us.
Okay, we'll be sure to do that. Thank you. Mr. Fong.
Thank you for your testimony. I guess my focus, I guess, is to try to, I think it's important for all of us to operate on the same information. So I'm hearing that the funding gap has grown over time. What is the current funding gap? If Mr. Thompson, the LAO, could answer that. How much money do we have now, and how much money do we need?
Yeah, so our look at the presently available revenues suggests that the authority might have somewhere north of $21 billion available through 2030 if you include cap and trade revenues at their estimation of about $750 million a year through 2030 to fund construction of the initial operating segment. As you see in the business plan, the expected capital cost of construction is somewhere closer to $30 billion. So that would leave you with a funding gap of roughly $8 billion, $8 or $9 billion.
Say that again. We have $21 billion right now through 2030 identified.
Identified resources that will come to the authority.
Okay, but the total project costs 77 to 98 billion.
That's for the whole phase one, correct?
Phase one. All right, so they have $21 billion now, right?
Right.
And the whole cost is 77 to 98 billion.
That's right.
So the delta is larger. It's not 8 billion. It's 56. If I'm 56 billion to 77 billion.
Yes, I was referring to the initial operating segment. Excuse me. Yeah.
All right. So the initial operating segment, just to get it done, is 8 billion. But to finish the whole thing, it's 56 to 77 billion.
That's right. And as Mr. Kelly indicated, that's roughly the identified cost of that Pacheco Pass tunneling segment.
And so, yeah, but the Pacheco Pass has that money hasn't been identified.
That's correct.
So that's missing.
That's right.
So we don't even know that. Do we know how much the Pacheco Pass is going to cost?
The central cost estimates are somewhere in that ballpark of around $8 billion, but I defer to the authority to give you a better number.
Okay. So if I was going to, if to the general public, we need 56 to 77 billion dollars to finish this whole project, with understanding, stipulating that the authority has identified $21 billion.
That sounds about right.
And then to Mr. Thompson, you spoke to something that perked my, I guess I didn't know this, but you mentioned before that in the previous business plan there was an identification of a sales tax or a tax on fuels to finish this project. Can you elaborate on that?
The 2000 business plan, the first one was to be financed with a sales tax. I don't think anyone has ever mentioned a sales tax on fuels in any of the business plans.
Okay, but you identified it as a potential long-term revenue stream.
Among a lot of others, but yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, right. Federal funds.
Sure.
Okay. In terms of, I guess if the gap is, if the delta is 56 to 77 billion, and there's no complete funding plan now, as you indicated on page 8 of your analysis, then how should the legislature proceed in assessing this project?
That's a question for the legislature to decide, but there are many options available to you, as there always have been. As Mr. Thompson indicated, 4 of the ones that spring to mind include calling into the project, shrinking the scope of the project, pursuing the project as identified in the draft 18 plan, or finding a way to commit sufficient funding to complete it through to the end of phase 1. And a variety of options are available in that respect as well, including additional dedicated taxation revenues, expanding the cap and trade allocation to the project, additional bonding authority, or allocating general fund monies to the project.
Okay, but in terms of what is outlined in the draft business plan, if I'm understanding correctly, even bonding against an uncertain cap and trade revenue stream, that creates even more uncertainty, right? If we are forced to look at the draft business plan, is my understanding correct? Is that the correct assessment?
I'm not quite sure Sure. I mean, I think certainly there, you know, as we discussed, there's a lot of uncertainty around future cap and trade revenues. There are potential ways to structure it where perhaps there's a little bit less uncertainty for the piece that would maybe go to high-speed rail, for example, rather than the percentages, a fixed amount, those types of things. But yeah, cap and trade is you know, as it stands right now, is an uncertain form of revenue.
And in terms of the look at the business plan, and if I look at the 4 options outlined by the peer review, right now we're on a path to create 2 segments that don't connect at the moment because of the funding gap. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then in terms of the speeds, because of the blended system, there are certain portions of the high-speed rail system that won't be as high speed, correct?
The current plans would extend, in effect, the Caltrain system to Gilroy. That section from San Jose to Gilroy would be operated at 110 miles an hour rather than some higher speed. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Kalra, Mr. Mullen, questions? Mr. Mullen? Oh, you're good. Okay. Well, if there's no further questions, thank you very much for your testimony here today. I think it was particularly insightful to hear from you, Mr. Thompson, regarding how we frame the issue going forward, and I'm going to give some thought to that question of where do we go from here, not so much what my answer is, but how we, as those who have oversight over this project, should be looking at the project and in the context of that, looking more closely at how we develop the source of funding. And I think the other big point you made is that a clarification of the future business operations and how that's going to work is also something that we should be discussing. We'll be having a change in administration as part of our democracy in the coming months, and it's, I think, a good opportunity for us to, given the change in leadership at the High-Speed Rail Authority and the changes that we've seen, sadly, at the federal level in terms of willingness to fund the project, at least in the near term. I'm hopeful, as Mr. Mullen mentioned, that we'll be able to turn that around in relatively short order. But for the time being, I think we need to look at how we're going to go this alone as a state and take stock of the various resources that we have and try to find the right way to move forward. So thank you for framing those issues, and it looks like you want to add something.
Let me just respond. The legislation created us as your advisors. Let me invite any of you, if we can provide information or advice or sit down and debate here, please feel free to do so.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and we will. Thank you to the LAO as well for your very insightful comments. We will move on to our third panel now, and then we'll take public comment on the draft business plan, and I think issue number 2. But we'll welcome Hassan Ikrada, the Chief Executive of